All right, ladies and gentlemen, I know you come here for the conversations, but I think we'll start with another conversation, and I will just keep talking for a little while until people notice that there's somebody else with a bigger machine talking than they are that can bring everybody to order. It's one of the wonderful things about these conferences is that the most exciting conversations are in the breaks, and that's actually saying something because the panels are always very interesting conversations too. So, good afternoon. My name is Pierre de Vries. I'm co-director of the Spectrum Policy Initiative at Silicon Flatirons alongside Dale Hatfield. Welcome to our annual Spectrum conference called Spectrum Hall of Shame, the worst and best radio policy decisions. I wanted to just say a few words to tee up why we're having this conversation, what we thought when we were setting it up we might get out of it. Silicon Flatirons' tagline, there it is know what's next. And as a history geek, to me, I'm always reminded of that famous quote that those who can't remember the past are condemned or are doomed to repeat it. So the purpose of today's conversations is to try and learn from these past policy decisions and to try and do better in the future. Now, we framed this in terms of good and bad. To some extent, I have to confess, to actually make people come and listen to the conversations. It makes for a good headline. But as I hope everybody understands, good and bad is in the eye of the beholder. There is no single policy that everybody will agree is good or everybody will agree is bad. And so what we're trying to do is to learn lessons about how things happened in the past and to try and do things a bit better in the future. So before we start, I just wanted to flag two resources that we have for this conference, things we are trying out. So there is a handout. If you didn't get one when you checked in at the registration, there are plenty of them still on the desk. This is a sort of a compilation of about 21 spectrum policy ideas. And what we're trying to do here is to just give you 200 words to give you a quick intro. Probably the panelists will talk about these things. They will define what they mean by them. But this is just a quick reference. There are also references in there. And if you want to look up these things online while you're sitting here on your laptop, I hope that's the only reason you'll be using your laptop. It's on the event website in the right-hand rail. So, these things are not authoritative. They're not trying to be authoritative. They're just to help you follow along. The other thing that we thought we'd try is, let's see if this works. Yes, this works. So we created this unscientific poll. It's up on SurveyMonkey. If you were registered, you got this in email yesterday. So if you haven't voted yet, please vote. If you are trying to get access to your 3G network and it's not working because it's indoors, there is free Wi-Fi access, UCB guest. And actually, when I sort of put please only vote once a couple of days ago on that, the last time we tried the poll, my hacker friends in the room, it was a different piece of software. They very rapidly said, can I break this? Can I vote more than once? And the answer was yes. And even here, you can vote more than once, but please don't. If you've done the poll, or if you do the poll, you'll see we're just giving you 12 very, very short descriptions, very cryptic, very vague, very ambiguous, and asking you to rate them as either awful, bad, good, or awesome. And the idea is just to get you thinking about what you think about these topics, and then you'll hear the panelists and see, whether they changed your mind about that. I thought it might be fun to just give you a snapshot of the results so far. This is what I was looking at earlier this morning. So this is the SurveyMonkey page. These are the results. These are the 12 questions that were asked. You'll see that there have been, at this point when this snapshot was taken, 76 replies. The way I've scored these is from -2 is awful, -1 is bad, +1 is good, +2 is awesome. And so if you do those things and you calculate the weighted average, you'll get some numbers. And so there are two things that actually jumped out at me when I looked at these numbers. The one is that there really isn't consensus. If you actually look at the scores, if there was complete consensus that something was awesome and everybody voted +2, the answer would be +2. Or if everybody agreed it was awful, it would be -2. Actually, the score is about, 0.5. And given that we only have 76 results here, and it's a totally unscientific, poll, who knows what the errors are? They're huge. The thing that struck me was looking at them, there was not a single one of these where we didn't have people who thought it was awful and other people who thought the same thing was awesome. And that's probably because you can look at each of those things and say, well, exactly what does that question mean? And I hope that's what we'll get to. The other thing that struck me was that people actually care about this stuff. As a spectrum geek, I don't assume that anybody else would care. But we actually had ballot stuffing on this poll, believe it or not. When I went to bed last night, there were 32 votes. When I woke up this morning, there was 63. And essentially, all of those were in one category. And almost all of them thought that in the cellular next to GPS brackets light squared, thought that it was awesome. So that just gives you a sense of, this is very unscientific, you should not draw any conclusion from this, and listen to the panelists. So, a few things before we start. I'd like to thank our sponsors, our supporters, our wonderful supporters. If you have the program, please look in the back. There's a list of our supporters. If you are a supporter, thank you so much. We couldn't do this without you. If you're not a supporter and you meet a supporter, please thank them. I'd like to thank the law school and Dean Jim Anaya for all the support we get, this wonderful courtroom to do this event in. I'd love to thank, and I'm very grateful to our speakers, the keynote speakers, the panelists, the moderators. They've put in an enormous amount of work preparing for this event, traveling here and actually spending at least half a day, if not more, with us here today. A special shout out to Brian Tremont. He actually planted the seed that led to this event, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the Silicon Flatiron staff and the Silicon Flatiron student group, who are the folks outside there and in the room here, who've been working very hard to make all this a success. A couple of announcements. This event is being live streamed. It will be archived on YouTube. You will get those links, and the links will be up on the web page. This event is open to the press. If you have a Twitter habit, we are #SiliconFlatirons. In order to actually move to the conversations, we've asked the moderators of the panels not to actually give you the exhaustive resumes, which are very impressive. You can read faster than they can talk. So please, if you have a question, if you don't know who somebody is, please look them up in this little booklet. The last thing, for those of you in the room who are introverts and who get overloaded by too much conversation, thank you, that at least it's not just me. We have something called the Introverts Refuge. There's a little courtroom just on the other side of that wall. So if you need a break, go there, and the rule is no communication. Don't talk to anybody there. Don't talk on the phone. It's just a place for us introverts to decompress. So with that, we now get into the really good stuff. So I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, but before I do that, I need to try and remember how I make this screen go away. And I remembered. So our opening keynote is by Jessica Rosenworcel. I'm going to break my own rules, and I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction because I can't resist. I guess it's convener's privilege. She's a member of the FCC, has been since 2012, with a little hiatus last year. Obviously, she's really knowledgeable about communications issues in general, but very knowledgeable about spectrum in particular. Obviously, she knows and understands the politics and this, the public interest, but she's also very knowledgeable about the technology and the ideas. So, for example, she's really interested in experimentation, innovation. She's been looking at blockchain for spectrum management. So, lots of very interesting things. Another impressive thing for me about Commissioner Rosenworcel is she actually cares about the right answer, which is something that's important to us here at Silicon Flatirons, and that's what we try to do. So, in these hyper-partisan times, it's really striking when somebody will actually go against their chairman on the FCC on some issues, or when they actually collaborate with the commissioner from the other party on issues. And Commissioner Rosenworcel has done that. Last but not least, we have very good local connections. She and Phil Wise are actually, I learned today, went to law school together, worked together on the incentive auction. And also she has very good judgment. She actually hired one of our alums, Travis Littman, and that's probably the biggest gold star. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Jessica Rosenworcel.
Thank you, Pierre, and good afternoon, fellow Spectrum geeks. You might not think you are, but by the end of this day. It is great not to be in Washington and be here, of course, in beautiful Boulder at this Silicon Flatirons conference. It is a treat to kick it off because you really do know how to start a party, calling it the Spectrum Hall of Shame. And I admit, I spent some time considering whether it's an honor or a slight that you asked me to get this conversation started. But I actually think we can learn a lot from shame. I think owning up to our mistakes is powerful. It provides us with the opportunity to do better. And in fact, I think there's a deep undercurrent of optimism in studying what went wrong so we can figure out how to make it right. I feel like at the outset, though, I have to point out that a lot has gone right with our spectrum policy. In fact, it's really hard to overstate the audacity of the United States when it comes to spectrum policy. Because over the long arc of history, we've done so many unconventional things, and we've done them first. It was more than 2 decades ago that we took the academic ideas of Ronald Coase and reimagined how we distribute our airwaves. Instead of doling out specific licenses for specific uses based on political cues, we ushered in a new era of spectrum auctions, selling access to bidders and allowing them to use it however they chose. It's really hard to remember now, but these ideas were once mocked by experts, opposed by industry, and dismissed by policymakers. But in the rearview mirror, it's kind of worked out okay, because the Federal Communications Commission has held nearly 90 auctions. We've issued more than 44,000 licenses through auction, and we have raised, in doing so, more than $140 billion in revenue. And as a result, our efforts have become a model for nations worldwide. We also pioneered the use of unlicensed spectrum. We took this handful of underused frequencies known as garbage bands that everyone else thought was junk in the 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, and 5.8 gigahertz bands, and we decided to test a new model. Instead of dismissing these airwaves and just calling them garbage, we decided to set technical parameters, and then we did something that was totally radical. We gave the public access to these airwaves. This was really edgy stuff. And it was a move away from this government command and control spectrum policy. But this was a wild success because in time a standard was developed known as 802.11, and that's the spectrum where Wi-Fi was born. More recently, we blazed a trail with spectrum incentive auctions. Our two-sided broadcast incentive auction that we just held was the first of its kind worldwide. And we tested the proposition that existing spectrum licensees might voluntarily relinquish their rights in exchange for a cut of the proceeds from the subsequent re-auction of their airwaves for new commercial use. And so far, so good. That auction ended late last year, and regulators globally are taking note. But of course, and you knew this was coming, our audacious good works have not been without their equal and opposite counterpart, failures. we have no shortage of initiatives that did not go as well as planned. Pioneer's preference, anyone? Or maybe spending more than a decade on 800 megahertz rebanding. You get the idea. So today, in the spirit of learning from the past and building a brighter future, I want to focus on two specific spectrum bands where I think we can do a lot better. And that's the 5.9 gigahertz band and the 2.5 gigahertz band. And I want to walk you through their history and then provide ideas about what we can do right now so that we take these airwaves from the stuff of shame to spectrum success. All right. First idea involving the 5.9 gigahertz band. And I'm going to start by saying it's hard to avoid the buzz about driverless cars. You can question if these vehicles are ready for prime time, and you can quibble with the changes they require to our roadways and even our civic life. But you can't deny that a lot is riding literally on the future of how we drive. But here's the thing. Enthusiasm for autonomous vehicles is not new. In fact, if you fall down the internet rabbit hole far enough looking into self-driving cars, eventually you'll land on Francis Houdina and the American Wonder. You see, way back in 1925, Francis Houdina founded a radio equipment called Houdina Radio Control Company. From the get-go, this company was focused on reinventing transportation. In fact, as best I can tell, this company built the first radio-operated automobile. Here's how it happened. Houdina took a 1926 Chandler sedan, they don't make those anymore, and he rigged it with an antenna. Then he set it up so that the radio signals it received operated small electric motors that controlled speed and direction. And a crew trailing close behind in a second car maneuvered the remote-controlled Chandler. He cherished this makeshift effort, and he called it the American Wonder. Now, the American Wonder was the first driverless car to roll down the streets of New York City. Of course, Houdina made sure to take all the appropriate precautions. And by that, I mean he clung to the running board of the car, ready to take the wheel in an emergency. And this demonstration, maybe you guessed it, it did not go well. As the New York Times recounted, the radio car careened from left to right, down Broadway, around Columbus Circle, and south on Fifth Avenue, running into two trucks and a milk wagon. At 43rd Street, after a crash into a fire engine was barely averted, the police put an end to the experiment. But here's where this failure succeeded. This demonstration captured the public's imagination. We still swoon at the prospect of autonomous driving, and we still marvel about what it could mean, and we still experiment, just not on the streets of New York City. And so it was in 1999, about 2 decades ago, when the United States set aside 75 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for dedicated short-range communications, or DSRC. And DSRC was designed for cars to talk to one another in real time so that they could avoid accidents. And as the FCC has acknowledged, DSRC could improve the safety of warning by warning drivers of an impending dangerous condition so that they could take steps and corrective action. But you know, in the nearly 20 years since the FCC allocated this spectrum, that really hasn't happened. Today, autonomous vehicles have moved beyond DSRC to get around and communicate, and whether that's with things like radar, LiDAR, cameras, sensors, onboard mapping tools, or cellular and Wi-Fi networks. Of course, testing on DSRC continues, but right now we have just a few thousand vehicles on the road with DSRC capability, and that's out of the roughly 260 million cars in the United States. So let's be honest. Our bet on DSRC didn't pan out the way we thought it would. In fact, the National Transportation Safety Board has said it will be up to 3 decades now before the majority of vehicles on the road have DSRC capability, which is what is needed for this technology to be effective. And if you ask me, 50 years from spectrum start to finish is a long time. And I don't know about you, but I'm hoping at that point we will have flying cars, or at least being tested. So let me be clear. We need to support automobile safety. However, our spectrum policies supporting safety need to be current. So we should speed the way for our thinking about DSRC to be up to date. And when we do, let's acknowledge that other countries are doing this using far less spectrum than the 75 megahertz that the United States has set aside. In fact, only a small portion of those airwaves were actually set aside by the FCC for basic safety messaging. So it's time to take a fresh look at this band and see if we can update our commitment to safety and also develop more unlicensed opportunities for Wi-Fi. And this is a subject I've worked on extensively with my colleague, Commissioner Mike O'Reilly. It's important because Wi-Fi today is congested. Right now, there's over 9 billion Wi-Fi enabled devices. And by the end of the decade, we will see as many as 50 billion new devices connecting to our networks through the Internet of Things. Add this up, and we are going to need a significant swath of new unlicensed spectrum to keep up with demand. And the thing is, Congress actually saw this coming. Earlier this year, Congress asked the FCC to identify 100 megahertz of spectrum below 8 gigahertz for unlicensed use. And to meet this threshold, we need to take another look at the 5.9 gigahertz band. It's the ideal place to explore Wi-Fi expansion because it's adjacent to existing unlicensed band. And that means we have the opportunity to introduce new wideband channels, channels that will take advantage of new standards and deliver speeds even faster than a gigabit per second. In other words, this is where we have the potential to develop gigabit Wi-Fi. So good news, this effort is already underway because back in 2013, the FCC started a rulemaking to study the opportunities for more Wi-Fi in the 5.9 gigahertz band. And in 2016, the FCC developed a test plan in close coordination with NTIA and the Department of Transportation to determine the feasibility of DSRC and Wi-Fi sharing. And that first phase of that test plan, which involved tests in the FCC labs, is complete. I think it's time for the FCC to release the results of that testing, but we're going to have to do more than just make our work public. We need to update this effort. That's because our existing approach emphasizes co-channel sharing, when I think the momentum now would be for a solution that segments the band. So our test plans need to be modernized to reflect these changes, and we need to move our testing out of the lab and onto the road for real-world conditions. So, in sum on that, there is no shame in correcting course, and I think it's time to be ambitious and find a way forward that puts the 5.9 gigahertz band to fuller use. All right, my second idea is let's rethink the 2.5 gigahertz band. In his 1960 campaign for president, Senator John F. Kennedy described television as having the potential to teach more things to more people in less time than anything yet devised. I'm struck by how those words about the educational power of television sound, because to me they sound so much like the ones we use today to describe the delivery of broadband to our schools and students. And back to that in a moment. For now, it's important to know that this enthusiasm for educational television did not end with the presidential campaign. In 1962, President Kennedy signed the Educational Television Facilities Act, which provided the first funds for non-commercial broadcasting. And at the signing ceremony, you can go look up the picture. He is accompanied by Newton Minow, his hand-picked chairman of the FCC. You might remember that name because Newton Minow famously had his doubts. A year before the passage of that law, he called television a vast wasteland. But the year after passage, Chairman Minow set out to make educational television a reality. Under his leadership, the FCC introduced what was called Instructional Fixed Television Service, or ITFS. ITFS made its home in the 2.5 gigahertz band. Licenses were distributed to educational institutions committed to delivering instructional services to schools. It was a grand idea. Use the power of broadcasting to teach. Remake education. But history shows that even with all this enthusiasm for instructional television, many ITFS licensees were just not able to make full use of their license. So over time, the FCC permitted educational licensees to use these airwaves in another way. In essence, they gave up on educational television and they allowed them to lease them out to other spectrum interests for commercial use. So fast forward to 2004, the FCC took another look at ITFS. It renamed it the Educational Broadband Service. But of course, it did more than just rename these airwaves. It wanted to reimagine the possibilities of their use. And so it encouraged licensees to use them not just for instructional television, but for educational broadband. And some truly promising efforts to ensure online access for students followed in communities as diverse as Albemarle County, Virginia, and Desert Sands, California. But not by any means did every licensee find a way forward. Most of them were not able to put this spectrum to the educational broadband use the FCC intended and continue to lease it out. So that brings us to the present, and the FCC has, you guessed it, another rulemaking to address the 2.5 gigahertz band. But with the passage of time, this spectrum is now considered prime. It was Siberia at the point that the Kennedy administration set it aside. But today, these airwaves are considered to have the choice mix of propagation characteristics and capacity, capabilities, to make them part of what is essential for widespread 5G deployment. So what are we going to do? I think the educational history of this band is important. I think it should inform our actions going forward as we seek to put this band to greater use. So here's my idea. Today, 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires access to broadband. But FCC data show that as many as 1 in 3 households do not subscribe to internet service. And where those numbers overlap is what I call the homework gap. According to the Senate Joint Economic Committee, the homework gap's real. By their count, there are 12 million school-aged kids in this country who do not have access to broadband at home. And for students in households without broadband, getting homework done is hard. I've seen it firsthand in rural areas, urban areas, and everything in between. You see kids sitting in parking lots late in the evening just to get a free signal to do their nightly schoolwork. You see students sliding into booths at a fast food restaurant and typing their papers with a side of fries. You see parents cobbling together connectivity with trips to the homes of friends, relatives, and libraries with reduced hours just to help their children get their assignments done. I don't think it should be this hard, and we should do something about it. Because to have a fair shot at digital age success, every student needs online access, not just at school, but at home. For this reason, we need to move beyond the status quo in the 2.5 gigahertz band, and we need to find a way to honor the educational history of this spectrum and make more effective use in the present. We have an open proceeding that asks lots and lots of questions, but I think we need a more focused plan. Like with the 5.9 gigahertz band, there is no shame in admitting the 2.5 gigahertz band has not lived up to its potential. Now, I think what we have to do is take steps to change that. The FCC has unused 2.5 gigahertz licenses in its inventory. That's the equivalent of sitting in a regulatory closet, licenses ready to go. It also has the authority to hold other voluntary spectrum incentive auctions, Now, in this case, doing so would require addressing license size, long-term leasing, and other issues that are unique to this band. But if we were able to combine these two sources of 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, we would be able to hold a substantial nationwide auction for new flexible commercial use of key mid-band airwaves that are essential for 5G service. Then the funds in excess of those required to run the auction and pay for spectrum contributions from existing licensees could be turned into a homework gap initiative. This initiative could help fund the connectivity needs of those 12 million students who lack broadband at home through things like library loans of Wi-Fi hotspots and any other creative ideas we can come up with to ensure that no child is left offline. In short, we can honor what President Kennedy and his allies tried to do decades ago when they sought to spark educational use of technology using the 2.5 gigahertz band. We have an opportunity to now take a nod to that history, but do it in a way that is thoroughly modern and helps make sure every student has the connectivity they need for their schoolwork. I think we should explore it. I'm going to end my two-band musings here, because no matter where you stand on the bands I've discussed today, I hope we can all agree that both provide some opportunities to learn from the past. Our spectrum history features amazing, innovative triumphs. It also has a lot of airwaves that have become afterthoughts. But it's within our power to change that, and conversations like the one you're having here today is a terrific place to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Commissioner Rosenworcel. If anyone has things they want to follow up with her, questions, she will be around in the back of the room, so please do that. I'll ask the next panel to come up and get seated, and we'll start in a few minutes.